The private line on Na Gyu-sa's desk vibrated exactly 4 times before he picked up. He usually ignored calls after midnight. In his world, a late-night ring usually meant a warehouse was burning or a lieutenant was dead. He should have let it go to voicemail. Gyu-sa? The voice was faint, distorted by the international connection, but it cut through his composure like a serrated blade. Gyu-sa's office, a glass-walled fortress overlooking the neon veins of Seoul, suddenly felt like a vacuum. The weight of his gold signet rings felt like lead as his grip tightened on the receiver. Amy, our daughter is asking to meet you. 7 words. That's all it took for the air to leave the room. Outside, the city of Seoul hummed along at its usual indifferent pace. Inside, the clock had stopped. Amy Nalubwama, the woman who had vanished 13 years ago, leaving him with nothing but a torn wedding photo and a heart he'd spent a decade turning into stone. The woman who had fled not because she stopped loving him, but because he had become a man she could no longer recognize. And now, she was telling him he had a daughter who had been breathing, growing, and living for over a decade while he sat on a throne of blood and secrets. Before we dive into how a man who controls an empire handles the one thing he can't command, hit that subscribe button to see how Na Gyu-sa deals with the wreckage of a 13-year-old lie. Now let's begin. Gyu-sa did the math in his head. It was a reflex, a survivor's instinct. 13 years. They had signed the final divorce papers exactly 13 years and 4 months ago. The timeline was a jagged line that led to only one conclusion. Amy was already carrying his child the morning she walked out the door and never looked back. And for over 4,000 days, she had never said a single word. The dial tone hummed in Gyu-sa's ear long after the connection severed. A rhythmic, mechanical ghost that seemed to mock the sudden silence of the room. He didn't put the phone down. His fingers, adorned with gold and heavy with the history of 1,000 cold-blooded decisions, remained locked around the device. For 13 years, he had operated under the assumption that his life was a finished blueprint, a structure built on the wreckage of his marriage, reinforced by the absolute control he exercised over Seoul's underworld. Now, 7 words had acted like a demolition charge at the foundation. He stood up, the leather of his chair creaking in the stillness. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city. From this height, the people below were nothing more than flickering dots of light, easily managed and easily ignored. But Amy was no longer a dot of light. She was a physical weight in his chest, a memory he had tried to drown in a sea of business acquisitions and turf wars. "Jin-ho," he said, his voice raspy, barely reaching the intercom on his desk. His most trusted aide appeared at the door within seconds. Jin-ho took one look at Gyu-sa's face, the slight tremor in his jaw, the way his eyes seemed fixed on something miles beyond the horizon, and stopped. He had seen Gyu-sa survive assassination attempts and hostile takeovers without blinking. He had never seen him look haunted. "Sir, find her," Gyu-sa commanded, not turning around. "Amy Nalubwama. I want her current address, her employment records, her daily routine. And I want everything on the child." He paused, the word daughter catching in his throat like a shard of glass. "Everything." Jin-ho bowed and retreated, sensing the volatility in the air. Gyu-sa was left alone with the torn wedding photo on his desk. He picked it up, tracing the jagged edge where the paper had been ripped. He remembered the day it happened. It was the morning after the great purge of the northern docks, a night where he had come home smelling of iron and gunpowder. Amy hadn't screamed. She hadn't even cried. She had simply looked at him with a profound, quiet exhaustion and said, "I can't breathe in this house anymore, Gyu-sa. There's no room for life here." He had let her go because he was too proud to beg, and too addicted to the crown he was building. He had assumed her departure was a play for attention, a temporary retreat. But the weeks turned into months, and the months into 13 years of silence. As the hours bled into the early morning, the first dossier arrived. Gyu-sa didn't wait for Jin-ho to speak. He snatched the folder and spread the contents across the mahogany desk. There were photographs taken from a distance, surveillance shots that felt like a violation of a sanctity he no longer deserved. There was Amy. She looked older, her beauty refined by time and a strength he hadn't fully appreciated when they were young. She was laughing in one photo, standing outside a small, vibrant community center. She looked light, a stark contrast to the heavy, shadowed man staring at her image. Then he saw her. The girl was 12, nearly 13. Her skin was a beautiful blend of their heritages, a living bridge between his world and Amy's. She had his eyes, sharp, observant and slightly guarded, but she had Amy's smile. In the photo, she was carrying a violin case, her posture straight and proud. Her name was Imani. The name hit him with the force of a physical blow. Imani. Faith. Na sank back into his chair, the weight of the dossier feeling heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. He looked at the details of their life. They lived in a modest, tree-lined neighborhood, far from the concrete and steel of his territory. Amy worked as a cultural consultant and ran a youth mentorship program. Their life was colorful, loud, and filled with a community of people who protected one another not out of fear, but out of genuine love. He looked at his own hands, the tattoos on his knuckles representing years of loyalty to a lifestyle that had cost him the only thing that actually mattered. He realized then that Amy hadn't just left him. She had rescued their daughter. If she had stayed, Imani would have grown up in a fortress, surrounded by bodyguards and the constant scent of paranoia. She would have been a target before she could even walk. A wave of nausea rolled over him, not from the violence of his past, but from the sudden, sharp clarity of his own failure. He had spent 13 years thinking he was the one who had been wronged, the one who had been abandoned. In reality, he was the ghost haunting a life that had moved on to find peace. He pulled a cigarette from a silver case but didn't light it. He just held it, staring at the photo of Imani. She was asking to meet him. Why now? Did she know who he was? Did she know that the man who shared her eyes was the same man whose name was whispered in fear across the city? Na felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a decade. Genuine terror. He wasn't afraid of a rival's blade or a police raid. He was terrified of the judgment in a 13-year-old girl's eyes. He was terrified that he would look at her and see everything he could have been, and everything he had destroyed. Sir, Jin-ho's voice came over the intercom again. The car is ready if you wish to observe. Na stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He straightened his black shirt, the fabric momentarily concealing the ink on his chest. But he knew the tattoos were still there, etched into his skin just like his sins were etched into his soul. He put the torn photo of Amy into his breast pocket, right over his heart. No, Na said, his voice regaining some of its steel, though it was now tempered with a new, fragile purpose. We aren't going to observe. I'm going to see my daughter. He walked out of the office, his signet rings glinting in the dim hallway light. As he stepped into the elevator, he caught his reflection in the mirrored doors. For the first time in 13 years, he didn't see a boss. He saw a man who was desperately late for a meeting he should have had a lifetime ago. The descent began, the numbers on the display ticking down, each one feeling like a year of lost time being stripped away as he prepared to face the ghost of the man he used to be. The sleek black sedan moved like a silent shark through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Amy's neighborhood, its tinted windows reflecting the modest, colorful homes and the late afternoon sun. Inside, Na Gyu-sa felt entirely out of place. He was a man designed for the sharp edges of skyscrapers and the cold shadows of the docks, not for streets that smelled of cut grass and blooming jasmine. Beside him, Jin-ho remained silent, his hand hovering near the door handle, a reflex born from a decade of expecting an ambush. But the only threat here was the overwhelming sense of peace that Na knew he was about to shatter. When the car pulled up to the curb of a small, vibrant house with a bright yellow door, USA didn't move immediately. He watched a neighbor across the street watering a garden, the man waving at a passing cyclist. It was a world of simple gestures and safety. A world he had once told Amy was a fantasy for people who weren't realistic. Seeing it now, seeing how well she had built it without him, made his signet rings feel like shackles. He adjusted the collar of his black shirt, the silk sliding over the ink on his throat, and stepped out into the warm air. The walk to the front door felt longer than any trek he had made through a rival's territory. Every step he took felt like an intrusion, his heavy boots sounding discordant against the rhythmic chirping of crickets. He reached the yellow door and hesitated, his hand poised to knock. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he should be there. He wasn't sure if he was the hero of the story returning home, or the villain arriving to ruin the ending. He knocked 3 times. Sharp, authoritative, a habit he couldn't quite suppress. The door opened almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting just behind the wood. Amy stood there, and for a heartbeat, the 13 years between them vanished. She was wearing a simple linen dress, her hair pulled back, looking every bit the woman who had once been the only person capable of making him laugh. But the warmth he remembered was gone, replaced by a guarded, steel-like resolve. She didn't move back to let him in. She stood in the threshold, a living barricade. "You're early, USA," she said, her voice steady but cold. It wasn't a greeting. It was a statement of fact. "I've been late for 13 years, Amy. I didn't think a few minutes would matter now," he replied, his voice low, carrying the gravelly weight of a man who hadn't slept. He looked past her, his eyes searching the hallway for any sign of the girl from the photograph. The house smelled of spices, turmeric and ginger, and the faint, sweet scent of shea butter. It was a home filled with life, with a pile of shoes by the door and a violin case leaning against a small wooden bench. It was a staggering contrast to his own penthouse, which felt more like a museum for a man who had already died. "She's in the backyard," Amy said, noticing his gaze. She stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind her so they were alone in the small space. "We talk out here first." USA flinched, a microscopic movement that Amy caught instantly. He looked down at his hands, realizing he was standing in a defensive posture, his shoulders squared as if he were waiting for a strike. He forced himself to lean against the porch railing, trying to mimic the ease of the neighborhood, but the tattoos peeking out from his cuffs betrayed the lie. "I'm not here for a debt," he said, looking her in the eye. "I'm here because she asked. Why did you tell her? After all this time, why now?" Amy crossed her arms, her expression softening just enough to reveal the exhaustion beneath. "Because she isn't a baby anymore. She's observant." She started asking why she looked so much like the man in the torn photo I kept in my jewelry box. I couldn't lie to her, USA. I won't raise her on lies, even if the truth is complicated. Complicated, USA repeated, a bitter edge to his tone. "Is that what I am? A complication?" "You are a storm," Amy said, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And I spent 13 years building a roof over her head so she wouldn't get wet. Look at yourself. You're still wearing the uniform. You still have Jinho sitting in a car with enough firepower to start a small war. You haven't changed, have you?" USA looked toward the street where the black sedan sat like an ink blot on a clean page. He looked back at Amy, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes. Not fear for herself, but for the peace she had cultivated. He realized that his very presence was an act of violence against her tranquility. His Mafia aura, the status he had spent his life perfecting, was a poison here. "I did what I had to do to survive," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "And I did what I had to do to let her live," Amy countered. "If you want to see her, you leave the boss at the curb. You go back to that car, you tell Jinho to drive around the block, and you come back here as a man." Just a man. Can you even do that anymore? The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the distant sound of a lawnmower and the pounding of Gyu-sa's own heart. He looked at the yellow door, then back at the woman who knew him better than he knew himself. He turned, walked down the steps, and signaled to the car. Jin-ho looked confused but obeyed, the sedan pulling away and leaving Gyu-sa standing alone on the sidewalk, stripped of his protection and his shadow. He walked back up the steps, his hands empty, his heart exposed. Amy watched him, her hand finally moving to the door handle. She didn't smile, but she stepped aside, granting him entry into the sanctuary he had never deserved. "She's nervous," Amy whispered as he passed her. "Be gentle, Gyu-sa. She doesn't know about the docks or the wars. To her, you're just the man from the story who finally found his way back." Gyu-sa stepped into the hallway, the scent of the house wrapping around him like a shroud. He followed Amy toward the back of the house, his boots clicking softly on the hardwood, each step bringing him closer to the biggest confrontation of his life. As they reached the screen door leading to the garden, he saw her, a young girl sitting on a swing, her back to him, her dark curls caught in the late afternoon light. The world of shadows he had built vanished, leaving him standing in the sun, trembling for the first time in 13 years. The screen door creaked with a rhythmic, domestic sound that felt like a rebuke to Gyu-sa's very existence. He remained frozen on the threshold, his eyes locked on the girl on the swing. She hadn't turned around yet, still humming a melody that sounded hauntingly like the songs Amy used to sing in the early, quiet days of their marriage. Before he could take a single step toward her, Amy's hand clamped firmly onto his forearm. Her touch was not a caress. It was a restraint. "Not yet," she whispered, her voice a low vibration of authority. "She thinks I'm just letting a delivery man in. If you go out there now carrying all that darkness you haven't put down, you'll scare her. And if you scare her, Gyu-sa, you will never see her again. Do you understand me?" Gyu-sa looked down at Amy's hand against his black silk sleeve. The contrast in their skin was as striking as it had been 13 years ago, but the context had shifted entirely. Back then, he was the protector, the man who promised her the world. Now, she was the guardian of a world he wasn't even allowed to touch. He nodded slowly, his throat tight. He allowed her to lead him away from the garden door and into a small, sun-drenched kitchen that smelled of roasted coffee and old books. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a modest wooden chair. Gyu-sa sat, his large frame making the kitchen feel suddenly cramped. He placed his hands on the table, the gold of his signet rings catching the light. He felt exposed, stripped of the mahogany desk and the glass walls that usually served as his armor. Amy stood opposite him, leaning against the counter, her eyes searching his face for a trace of the man she had once loved. "You want to know why?" she began, her voice gaining a sharp, clinical edge. "You want to know how I could walk away with your blood in my veins and never send a word. You think it was a debt I owed you to tell you. 13 years, Amy," Gyu-sa said, his voice cracking. "I spent 13 years thinking you left because I wasn't enough. I didn't know there was a we to fight for. There was no we left that night, Gyu-sa. Don't you remember?" Amy's eyes flashed with a sudden, searing pain. "It was the night of the Namdaemun raid. I was 6 weeks pregnant. I had the positive test in my purse, wrapped in a ribbon. I was waiting for you at that Italian place you liked, the one with the private back room. I waited for 4 hours." Gyu-sa closed his eyes. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He remembered that night. Not the dinner, but the adrenaline. A rival faction had moved on his territory, and he had spent those 4 hours in a basement, proving exactly why he was the man everyone feared. He had turned his phone off. He had chosen the war. "When you finally showed up," Amy continued, her voice trembling now, "you didn't even apologize for the time. You had blood on your cuff, Gyu-sa. You sat down, ordered a drink, and told me that the business was finally secure. You looked so proud of yourself. You looked at me, and all I saw was a man who had more room in his heart for a turf war than for a family. I realized then that if I told you about the baby, she wouldn't be a daughter to you. She would be an heir. She would be a trophy. Or worse, she would be a target. I would have protected her, Gyu-sa growled, his hands clenching into fists on the table. By surrounding her with men like Jin-ho? By teaching her that power is the only thing that keeps you safe. Amy shook her head. That isn't protection, Gyu-sa. That's a cage. I chose to give her a life where she could breathe. I chose to pay the debt of your absence, so she wouldn't have to pay the price of your presence. The silence that followed was suffocating. Gyu-sa looked at his tattoos, the ink that marked him as a king in a world of shadows, and for the first time, he saw them as Amy did. A ledger of every time he had chosen violence over peace. He had built an empire, but he had lived in a graveyard of his own making. So why now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Because she deserves to know where her strength comes from, Amy said, her expression softening into something more complex. And because I see you in her, Gyu-sa. Not the boss, but the man who used to look at the stars and wonder if there was something more. She's starting to wonder, too. But let's be clear about the terms. She leaned forward, her shadow falling over his hands. You are Mr. Na, an old business associate from Korea. You are here for a brief visit. You do not talk about your work. You do not bring your men inside this gate. And if I see even a flicker of that man from Namdaemun, the one with the blood on his cuff, you are gone. No lawyers, no mafia threats. You will respect the peace I built for her, or I will vanish again, and this time even your ghosts won't find us. Gyu-sa looked at the door leading to the garden. He could hear the faint sound of the swing set creaking again. The boss inside him wanted to protest, to demand his rights, to use his power to force a place in this house. But as he looked at Amy, he realized she was the only person on earth who wasn't afraid of him, and that made her the only person he could truly trust. He stood up, his movements slow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, placing it face down on the table. He took off the heavy signet rings, the symbols of his underworld rank, and set them beside the phone. He stood before her, stripped of his titles, his armor, and his pride. I accept, he said. Amy looked at the rings on the table, then back at him. She saw the vulnerability he had tried so hard to hide in the thumbnail of his life. She walked to the screen door and pushed it open, the light flooding into the kitchen. Imani, she called out, her voice warm and clear. There's someone here I'd like you to meet. Gyu-sa followed her out, stepping from the shadows of his past into the blinding reality of his future. The girl on the swing stopped. She turned around, her eyes wide with curiosity. As Gyu-sa looked into the face of the 13-year-old debt he could never fully repay, the man who had destroyed his own composure felt the world tilt. He didn't know what to say, but for the first time in 13 years he was finally ready to listen. The late afternoon sun was gold and heavy, casting long, elegant shadows across the manicured grass of the backyard. Imani hopped off the swing, the chains clinking with a light, musical rhythm that seemed to vibrate in Gyu-sa's very marrow. She brushed her hands against her jeans and walked toward them, her gait possessing a natural, unhurried grace that she could only have learned in a house free from fear. As she drew closer, the physical resemblance became a physical ache. She had Gyu-sa's brow and his intense, focused stare, but the way she tilted her head was pure Amy. Imani, Amy said, her voice a steady anchor in the sudden turbulence of the moment. This is Mr. Na. He's an old colleague of mine from Seoul. He's in town for a very short visit and wanted to stop by. Gyu-sa felt the lie like a cold weight in his chest. Mr. Na, an associate, a stranger with a familiar face. He looked down at the girl, his daughter, and felt a terrifying urge to fall to his knees and beg for the 13 years he had squandered. Instead, He forced his hands to remain still at his sides, hiding the slight tremor that no rival or bullet had ever managed to provoke. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Na," Imani said. Her voice was bright and clear, carrying the soft lilt of her mother's accent mixed with the local surroundings. She extended a hand, a gesture of polite maturity that caught Gyu-sa off guard. He took her hand, his large, calloused palm nearly swallowing hers. Her skin was warm, a living testament to a decade of life he had played no part in. He expected to feel like a king finally touching his heir, but instead, he felt like a thief standing in a sanctuary. He released her hand quickly, afraid that the darkness etched into his own skin might somehow stain her. "The pleasure is mine, Imani," he managed to say. His voice was lower than usual, stripped of its commanding edge, sounding instead like the rustle of dry leaves. "Your mother has told me. She has told me you are a very talented musician." Imani's eyes lit up, the guarded curiosity replaced by a spark of genuine pride. "The violin? I'm okay. I'm practicing a concerto for the spring recital. It's Mendelssohn. It's really fast in the third movement." "Mendelssohn," Gyu-sa repeated, the name unfamiliar in his world of grit and steel. "Is it difficult?" "The fingering is," she said, stepping closer, her initial shyness evaporating as she realized this man was actually listening. "But my teacher says it's more about the heart than the fingers. If you don't feel the music, it just sounds like noise." Gyu-sa felt a sharp pang of irony. He had spent his life making noise, the noise of gunfire, the noise of shouting, the noise of heavy doors slamming shut. He had never learned to feel the music. He looked at Amy, who was watching them with an expression that was impossible to read. A mixture of maternal protection and a flickering, ancient sorrow. "Would you like to see it?" Imani asked suddenly. "My violin? It's inside on the bench." Gyu-sa glanced at Amy, seeking permission. She gave a single, curt nod, the conditions of their meeting hanging silently between them. "I would be honored," Gyu-sa said. They walked back into the house, the transition from the bright garden to the shaded hallway making Gyu-sa feel as though he were entering a dream. Imani picked up the case with practiced care, clicking the latches open to reveal the polished wood of the instrument. She didn't play, but she pointed out the scroll and the bridge, explaining how the varnish affected the tone. Gyu-sa stood over her, his shadow looming large against the wall. Yet he felt smaller than he ever had in his life. He wanted to tell her that he owned buildings in Seoul larger than her school. He wanted to tell her he could buy her 1,000 violins made by the masters. But as he watched her small fingers trace the wood, he realized those things were worthless here. She didn't need his money. She needed the man he had never bothered to be. "You look a lot like a photo my mom has," Imani said casually, looking up from the case. Her gaze was direct, unsettlingly perceptive. "In the photo, the man is younger and he's wearing a tuxedo. But he has the same eyes. Are you related to him?" The air in the room seemed to vanish. Gyu-sa felt the weight of the torn wedding photo in his breast pocket, the jagged edge pressing against his skin. He looked at Amy, who had gone perfectly still in the doorway. The truth was a physical pressure behind his teeth, a roar in his ears. "I am that man. I am your father. I am the reason you were raised in secret." But he saw the warning in Amy's eyes, the reminder of the peace he had already disturbed. If he spoke the truth now, he would be the storm she feared. He would be the Mafia boss claiming property, not a father seeking a soul. "He was a friend," Gyu-sa lied, the words tasting like ash. "A very close friend. We grew up together in the same part of the city. People often said we looked alike." Imani studied him for a long moment, her young mind weighing the answer. Finally, she shrugged, though a trace of doubt remained in the corners of her smile. He looked sad in the photo. Even though he was smiling, his eyes looked like they were looking for something they couldn't find. Gyu-sa felt his composure finally crack, a single hot tear threatening to betray him. He turned away under the guise of examining a bookshelf, his heart thudding against his ribs. He had spent 13 years looking for power, for loyalty, for respect. He had never realized he was looking for this. A quiet room, the scent of ginger, and a daughter who could see through his mask without even trying. "Mr. Na has to leave soon, Imani." Amy intervened, her voice soft but firm. She stepped into the room, placing a hand on Imani's shoulder. "He has a lot of business to attend to back in the city." "Oh," Imani said, her face falling slightly. "Will you come back? Maybe for the recital? It's in 3 weeks." Na turned back to her, his face a mask of controlled emotion. He looked at the girl who carried his blood and his eyes, yet knew nothing of his sins. He looked at the woman who had saved her from him. He knew that if he came back, he would have to bring a different version of himself. A man who had burnt his empire to the ground just to stand in the light of her smile. "If your mother allows it," Na said, his voice thick with a promise he wasn't yet sure he could keep. "I would like nothing more than to hear you play." As he walked back toward the yellow door, the silence of the house felt like a heavy cloak. He stepped out onto the porch, the cooling evening air hitting his face. He didn't look back until he reached the sidewalk. The black sedan was already idling at the corner, Jin-ho waiting to whisk him back to the world of shadows and signet rings. Na stood there for a moment, a solitary figure in a neighborhood of families. He had entered the house as a king in disguise, but as he watched the yellow door close, he realized he was leaving as a man who had finally discovered the true depth of his poverty. He had 13 years of silence to make up for, and as the car door opened for him, he knew that the business of Na Gyu-sa was over. The war for Imani had just begun. The transition from the blood-slicked marble of Seoul's underworld to the linoleum floors of a suburban community center was a shift so violent, it left Na feeling physically nauseous. For 2 weeks, he had lived a double life that was beginning to tear him apart. By day, he sat in his high-rise fortress, his voice a low growl as he crushed a brewing insurrection among his younger lieutenants who sensed his distraction. By afternoon, he stripped off his tailored suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves to hide the ink on his forearms, and sat on a cramped plastic chair in a drafty gymnasium, watching Imani practice the violin. He was currently seated in the 3rd row, clutching a lukewarm paper cup of coffee like it was a lifeline. To the other parents, he was Mr. Na, the quiet, intense businessman who always looked like he was mourning a lost relative. He tried to mimic their ease, the way they checked their phones and whispered about weekend soccer games, but his predatory instincts remained dialed to a lethal frequency. Every time the gym door creaked open, his hand instinctively twitched toward a holster that was no longer there. "You're holding that cup so hard it's going to shatter," Amy whispered, sliding into the seat beside him. Na didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on Imani as she tuned her strings on the small stage. "I don't like having my back to the door, Amy. Especially not in a room with only 2 exits. It's a music rehearsal, Na, not a sit-down with the triads," she replied, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She reached over and gently pried his fingers away from the cup. "Relax. You're scaring the PDA president." He let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since he left the office. Just an hour ago, he had been staring down Park Sang-woo, a hungry young tiger who had started taxing territories without Na permission. The confrontation had been quiet but brutal. Na had broken a man's fingers with a heavy glass ashtray just to remind the room who still held the crown. The phantom scent of copper and expensive cologne still clung to his skin, a sharp contrast to the smell of floor wax and teenage sweat in the gym. Imani caught his eye from the stage and gave a small, hesitant wave. Na felt the familiar, terrifying jolt in his chest. He raised a hand in return, a stiff, awkward gesture that felt like a foreign language. He was a man who commanded thousands, Yet he didn't know how to smile at a 13-year-old girl without looking like he was planning a heist. "She's getting better," Gyu-sa said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The third movement. She isn't stumbling on the tempo anymore. She practices until her fingers bleed because she knows you're coming," Amy said softly. She looked at him then, her gaze tracing the exhaustion etched into his features. "Is it getting harder? Keeping the two worlds apart?" "The business doesn't like silence, Amy. They think I'm growing soft because I'm not at the clubs every night. They think I'm losing my edge because I'm checking my watch at 4 p.m. to make it to a recital." "Are you?" Gyu-sa looked at Imani, who was now tucking the violin under her chin, her expression one of pure, focused serenity. He thought of the broken fingers and the cold threats he'd issued earlier. "I'm not losing my edge. I'm just realizing how blunt it's always been." His phone vibrated in his pocket, a heavy, rhythmic pulse that signaled an emergency. He tried to ignore it, but the vibration persisted, a persistent ghost from the world he was trying to bury. He stood up abruptly, the plastic chair scraping loudly against the floor. Several parents turned to stare. "I have to take this," he muttered, his jaw tight. "Gyu-sa, she's about to start," Amy warned, her voice laced with the old disappointment. "I'll be 2 minutes. I promise." He ducked into the hallway, the cool air hitting his face. He answered the phone before the third ring. "I told you not to call me during these hours unless the building was on fire. Jin-ho." "Sir, it's Park." Jin-ho's voice was urgent, strained. "He didn't take the warning. He's moved into the southern district. He's telling the elders you've gone senile, that you're playing house with a woman from your past. They're meeting tonight at the pier. If you aren't there to stop them, the vote will pass. You'll be stripped of the chairmanship by morning." Gyu-sa leaned his forehead against the cold cinder block wall. The Mafia logic in his brain screamed at him to leave now, to call in his loyalists and paint the pier red. If he lost the chairmanship, he lost the power to protect Amy and Imani. He would be a target, and they would be his greatest vulnerability. "Sir," Jin-ho pressed. "The car is outside." Through the thin wooden doors of the gym, the first notes of Mendelssohn's concerto began to drift into the hallway. It was Imani. The melody was soaring, fragile, and impossibly beautiful. It was the sound of a world that didn't know about peers or coups or broken fingers. "Tell the elders I'll be there," Gyu-sa said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "But tell Park if he mentions my family again, he won't live to see the vote. I have 1 hour, Jin-ho. Not a second more." He hung up and walked back into the gym. He didn't sit down. He stood at the back, shadowed by the equipment racks, watching his daughter play. She was brilliant. For a few minutes, the coup, the betrayal, and the violence of his life didn't exist. There was only the music and the girl with his eyes. When she finished, the room erupted in modest applause. Imani looked toward his empty seat, her smile faltering for a split second until she spotted him standing in the back. He gave her a single, firm nod, the highest praise he knew how to give. He didn't wait for her to come off the stage. He slipped out the side exit, the transition back to the darkness of the sedan feeling like a descent into a grave. As Jin-ho pulled away from the curb, Gyu-sa reached into the glove box and pulled out his signet rings, sliding them onto his fingers one by one. The gold felt cold. The weight felt familiar. "The pier," Gyu-sa commanded, his expression becoming the untouchable mask of the boss once more. "And Jin-ho, make sure my shirt stays clean. I have to take Imani for ice cream after this." The car sped away, a black streak against the twilight. As Na Gyu-sa prepared to kill the man he used to be so he could protect the father he was desperately trying to become. The two worlds had finally collided, and he knew that by the time the sun rose, only one of them would be left standing. The rain began as a soft, rhythmic drumming against the roof of Amy's home, a sound that usually brought Gyu-sa a fleeting sense of peace. But tonight, The air inside the house was thick with a different kind of tension. USA sat at the small dining table, his large frame feeling more like a caged animal than a guest. Opposite him sat Moses, Amy's older brother, a man whose presence was as immovable as a mountain. Moses had flown in from Kampala the day before, and the moment he had laid eyes on USA, the air in the room had turned to ice. Moses didn't look like a man who dealt in shadows, but he had the eyes of a soldier, observant, weary, and entirely unimpressed by the gold on USA's fingers. He had been the one to help Amy move her life across oceans 13 years ago. He had been the one to hold her hand through the labor USA had missed. To Moses, USA wasn't a powerful chairman. He was the scar on his sister's heart. In my culture, Moses began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that filled the kitchen. A man's wealth isn't measured by the stones on his hand or the height of his tower. It is measured by the safety of his gate. 13 years ago, Amy ran to my gate because yours was wide open to wolves. USA didn't flinch, though the words stung more than the bruises from the pier the night before. He had cleaned the blood from his knuckles and changed into a soft, charcoal sweater, attempting to look like the Mr. Na Imani believed him to be. But Moses saw through the wool. He saw the way USA's eyes scanned the room for exits. He saw the predator trying to play the pet. I made mistakes, USA said, his voice low and gravelly. I allowed the business to become my heir. I thought providing meant conquering. I was wrong. Being wrong is a luxury for children, USA. Moses countered, leaning forward. The light from the overhead lamp glinted off his dark skin, highlighting the protective set of his shoulders. When a man with your life is wrong, people die. My sister almost died of a broken spirit because of your business. And now you come here, smelling of expensive smoke and old sins, wanting to play father to a girl who has known only peace. From the living room, the faint, melodic strains of Imani's violin drifted toward them. She was practicing a slower piece today, something soulful and wandering. The sound seemed to pull at the tension in the kitchen, a reminder of what was truly at stake. I am not playing, USA said, his gaze meeting Moses's with an intensity that would have made a lieutenant tremble. I am dismantling it. All of it. I am cutting the ties, Moses. I am burying the chairman so the father can live. Moses let out a short, skeptical laugh. A man like you doesn't just quit. The shadows don't let go that easily. You bring danger with you like a scent. If I let you stay, if I let you be near her, am I inviting the wolves to this house? USA reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a weapon or a bribe. He pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger, the real records of his personal holdings, the ones that were clean, taxed, and legal. He pushed it across the table toward Moses. That is the future, USA said. Education funds, trusts, properties in Amy's name. It's all separated from the organization. If I fall, they are protected. If I live, I am a man with a modest income and a very long list of apologies to make. Moses didn't look at the book. He looked at USA's eyes. Money is just paper. I want to know what happens when the wolves come for you. Because they will. Will you use my niece as a shield? Or will you be the shield? I have spent my life being a sword, USA replied, his voice cracking with a raw, unscripted honesty. But for her, I would let the world break me before I let a single shadow touch her. I am here because I have nothing left but the truth. I missed 13 years of her life because I was a coward who loved power. I won't spend the rest of my life being the monster she remembers, if she ever finds out. The silence stretched, measured by the ticking of a clock on the wall and the rain against the glass. Amy appeared in the doorway, her eyes moving between the two men. She saw the ledger on the table and the desperate, naked sincerity on USA's face. She walked over and placed a hand on Moses's shoulder. He stayed for the whole rehearsal yesterday, Moses, she said softly. Even when his phone wouldn't stop ringing, he stayed. Moses looked at his sister, then back at Gyu-sa. He saw the vulnerability that Gyu-sa had tried so hard to hide beneath his Mafia mask. He saw a man who was finally realizing that the greatest power wasn't in commanding others, but in surrendering to those you love. Slowly, Moses stood up. He didn't offer a hand in friendship, but he didn't point toward the door either. There is a dinner tonight. Amy is making matuk and peanut stew. My mother's recipe. If you are going to be a part of this family, you will sit at the table. You will listen to the stories of the ancestors you tried to replace with your towers. And you will help with the dishes. Gyu-sa felt a wave of relief so powerful it made his knees weak. It wasn't a full pardon, but it was a bridge. I can do that, he said. And Gyu-sa? Moses added, stopping at the door. Leave the rings in your pocket. In this house, we don't care about kings. We only care about brothers. As Gyu-sa sat alone in the kitchen for a moment, the sound of Imani's violin grew louder, a triumphant swell in the music. He looked at his bare hands, the tattoos on his knuckles looking strangely out of place against the domestic warmth of the room. He was a long way from the pier, and even further from the man he used to be. For the first time in 13 years, the gate wasn't open to wolves. It was open to him. He stood up, adjusted his sweater, and walked toward the living room, ready to serve a family he was finally beginning to earn. The air in Gyu-sa's high-rise office was cold, stripped of the usual incense and the low hum of subservient voices. For the first time in his career, the desk was clear of everything except 3 burner phones and a single heavy master key. Outside, the skyline of Seoul sparkled like a collection of jagged diamonds, but Gyu-sa wasn't looking at the view. He was looking at his own reflection in the darkened glass, noticing how the absence of his signet rings made his hands look strangely bare, exposed, like a soldier who had walked into a barrage without a shield. He was systematically dismantling the armor he had spent 20 years forging. Over the last 48 hours, he had signed over the deeds to the underground gambling dens in Gangnam and shuttered the high-interest lending firms that had been the backbone of his liquidity. To the outside world, it looked like a retreat. To his board of directors, it looked like insanity. But to Gyu-sa, it was the only way to wash the scent of the docks off his skin before he sat down to dinner with Imani. The elders are calling it a bloodless suicide. Sir, Jin-ho said, standing by the door. His voice was thick with a concern that bordered on grief. They don't understand. They think you've been compromised by a foreign power. Park Sang-woo has already moved his men into the empty spaces you left behind. He isn't just taking the business, Gyu-sa. He's taking the leverage we used to keep you alive. Let him have the scraps, Jin-ho, Gyu-sa replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He didn't turn around. A crown is only heavy if you're afraid of losing it. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm tired. If you give up the protection of the chairmanship, you become a private citizen with 1,000 enemies and no wall to hide behind. You're removing your armor while the archers are still on the roof. Gyu-sa finally turned, his eyes reflecting a weary, luminous clarity. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing the intricate black ink that spiraled from his wrists to his shoulders. To anyone else, these were symbols of terror. To him, they were a ledger of lost time. I've spent 13 years hiding behind walls, Jin-ho, and in all that time I never saw my daughter's face. I'd rather be a target who is loved than a king who is a ghost. He picked up the first burner phone and dialed a number he had memorized years ago, a direct line to a high-ranking official in the Seoul Metropolitan Police. It was the vulnerability clause he had drafted in the silence of his own mind. He wasn't just closing the businesses. He was providing the evidence needed to ensure they could never be reopened by his successors. He was burning the bridge behind him, knowing full well he was still standing on it. This is Na Gyu-sa, he said into the phone, his voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in his veins. I'm sending a courier with the ledger for the Incheon logistics hub. Consider it a gift for the public. In exchange, I want a permanent detail removed from a specific residential address in the suburbs. I don't want your sirens anywhere near my family. I'll handle the rest." He hung up and dropped the phone into a glass of water, watching the screen flicker and die. One by one, he repeated the process, severing the veins of his empire until the silence in the office was absolute. He felt lighter, yet more fragile than he had ever been. Without the chairman title, he was just a man with a complicated past and a very uncertain future. The risk was immediate. As he left the building, the usual phalanx of black-suited guards was absent. He had dismissed them, sent them home with severance packages that bought their silence but not necessarily their loyalty. He walked to his car alone, the echo of his footsteps in the parking garage sounding like a countdown. He knew Park's men were watching from the shadows. He could feel the crosshairs on the back of his neck, the invisible weight of a dozen grudges suddenly finding their mark. He got into the driver's seat of a modest, silver SUV, a vehicle that wouldn't stand out in Amy's neighborhood. He checked the rearview mirror, not for a tail, but to look at himself. He saw a man whose face was finally beginning to match his age. The hardness was still there in the set of his jaw, but the predatory glint in his eyes had been replaced by a desperate, flickering hope. He drove toward the suburbs, the transition from the neon chaos of the city to the soft amber glow of the residential streets feeling like a journey through time. He stopped at a red light and looked at his hands on the steering wheel. They were trembling. It wasn't the fear of death that unnerved him. It was the fear of being just Gyu-sa. Without the power, without the fear he commanded, would Amy still see something worth saving? Would Imani still want to meet the man behind the Mr. Na mask? As he pulled into the driveway of the yellow-doored house, he saw the silhouette of Imani in the window, her violin bow moving in a slow, graceful arc. He sat in the car for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. He reached into his pocket and touched the small, wooden carving he had bought for her. A simple bird, made by a local craftsman, with no gold, no gems, and no hidden meaning. It was the first gift he had ever given that didn't come with a price tag or a power play. It was a piece of the man he was trying to be. He stepped out of the car, his chest tight with the knowledge that he was now completely unprotected. He had removed the armor, discarded the crown, and walked away from the only life he knew. He was a man walking into a storm with nothing but a wooden bird and a prayer. But as he reached for the doorbell, he realized that for the first time in 13 years, he wasn't afraid of the dark. He was only afraid of the silence if she stopped playing. The following afternoon, the suburban peace Gyu-sa had grown to crave was shattered by a sound he knew too well. The low, synchronized hum of multiple high-displacement engines. He was standing in the kitchen, helping Amy dry the dishes from a late lunch, when the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He didn't need to look out the window to know that the silver SUV in the driveway was no longer alone. "Amy, get Imani into the pantry. Now," he said, his voice dropping into that icy, subsonic frequency that had once commanded the docks of Incheon. "Gyu-sa? What is it?" Amy's face went pale, her hands freezing on a ceramic plate. "Do not ask. Just go. Lock the door and do not come out until I call your name." He didn't wait for her to argue. He moved to the front window, peeling back the curtain just enough to see 3 black sedans idling at the curb. Park Sang-woo stepped out of the lead car. He wasn't wearing the traditional dark suit of a soldier. He was dressed in a casual tracksuit, a calculated insult intended to show how little he respected Gyu-sa's retirement. Behind him, 4 men spilled out of the other vehicles. They weren't carrying long guns. That would attract the police too quickly. But the weighted bulges under their jackets told Gyu-sa everything he needed to know. They were here for a cleanup operation. Gyu-sa felt the old, familiar heat rising in his chest. His heart rate slowed, his vision sharpened, and for a split second, the chairman screamed to be let out. He could reach for the kitchen knife, slip out the back, and take them one by one in the tall grass. He could revert to the man who chose the gang war over Amy 13 years ago. But then he heard a small, muffled sob from the pantry. Imani. He looked at his hands. They were bare. No rings, no blood. If he killed these men here in front of this house, he would be giving Park exactly what he wanted. Proof that Na Gyu-sa was still a monster. He would win the fight but lose his daughter forever. Stay there, Gyu-sa whispered to the empty kitchen. More a prayer than a command. He stepped out onto the porch, closing the yellow door firmly behind him. He stood at the top of the wooden steps, alone and unarmed, his charcoal sweater a soft target against the bright afternoon light. Park stopped at the edge of the lawn, a smirk playing on his young, hungry face. "You look different without the office, Chairman," Park called out, his voice loud enough to carry to the neighbors. "You look small. The elders said you were giving away the keys to the kingdom for a woman and a brat. I didn't believe them until I saw this place. It smells like laundry detergent and failure." "The business is yours, Park," Gyu-sa said, his voice steady. "I've signed the papers. The police have the ledgers. There is nothing left for you to take. There is the matter of my pride." Park spat, stepping onto the grass. "You made me look like a fool in front of the lieutenants. You broke my cousin's fingers. You think you can just walk away and be a mister? Nah? The world doesn't work that way. Blood follows blood." The four men moved to flank Park, their hands hovering near their waistbands. Gyu-sa felt the adrenaline surging, that predatory instinct urging him to strike first. He could see the opening, a quick leap, a strike to the throat, a disarm. But he stayed his hand. He thought of the wooden bird in his pocket. He thought of the third movement of Mendelssohn. "If you move on this house, you lose everything," Gyu-sa said, his voice echoing with a terrifying, quiet authority. "I've already set a timed release on the digital encryption for the slush funds. If I don't check in every hour, those accounts vanish. You'll have the territory, Park, but you'll be broke. Your men won't stay loyal for a king who can't pay the bills." Park paused, his eyes narrowing. He was a man of violence, but he was also a man of greed. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Gyu-sa replied. He stepped down one stair, closing the distance. "But know this. I am not the man I was 13 years ago. Back then, I would have killed you and everyone in those cars without a second thought. Today, I'm just a father who wants to take his daughter for ice cream. And a father with nothing left to lose is much more dangerous than a chairman with an empire to protect." Gyu-sa walked down the remaining steps, crossing the lawn until he was standing inches from Park. He didn't raise his fists. The sun was beginning to set over the quiet suburban street, casting a warm, honey-colored glow that softened the sharp edges of Gyu-sa's silhouette. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at the horizon for threats. He was looking at the woman standing beside him on the porch. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, jagged vacuum of the last 13 years. It was a space being filled, slowly and deliberately, with the possibility of a shared future. "You really closed them all?" Amy asked, her voice barely a whisper. She was leaning against the railing, her eyes fixed on Imani, who was in the driveway attempting to teach Moses a few basic notes on the violin. The scene was chaotic and filled with laughter, a sound that still felt like a miracle to Gyu-sa. The gambling dens, the docks, the high-interest firms. "They're gone," Gyu-sa replied. He stood beside her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his charcoal sweater. "The legal entities, the construction firm and the logistics center, have been restructured into a trust for Imani. I'm no longer the chairman, Amy. I'm just a man with a very clean record and a lot of free time." Amy turned to him, her expression searching. "It wasn't just about the safety, was it? You didn't do it just to stop the wolves." "No," Gyu-sa admitted, meeting her gaze. "I did it because I realized that as long as I held that crown, I couldn't hold your hand. I couldn't be the man Imani thinks I am. I spent half my life building a fortress, only to realize I was the only prisoner inside it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, weathered wedding photo, the one he had carried like a curse for 13 years. He looked at the jagged edge where he had torn it in a fit of prideful rage the night she left. Then he pulled out a small piece of transparent tape. With steady fingers that were no longer stained by the business, he carefully aligned the two halves and mended the photo. "I've carried the broken piece for too long," he said, handing the restored photo to her. "I'd like to stop looking at what we lost and start looking at what we have." Amy took the photo, her thumb tracing the seam where the paper met. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. "It's not going to be like it was, USA. We aren't those kids anymore. I'm not the woman who waits at Italian restaurants, and you aren't the man who can solve everything with a checkbook. I don't want it to be like it was," USA said, stepping closer. The scent of her, shea butter and home, wrapped around him, grounding him in a way the towers of Seoul never could. "That version of us died a long time ago. I want to build something new, something honest. I want to be the man who shows up for the rehearsals, who helps Moses with the garden, and who earns the right to be called Appa one day." From the driveway, Imani let out a triumphant shout as Moses managed to produce a clear, vibrating note on the strings. She looked back at the porch, her face lit with a radiant, uncomplicated joy. "Did you hear that, Mr. Na? Uncle Moses is a natural." USA felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Amy, a silent question in his eyes. She smiled, a real, weary, beautiful smile, and nodded. "Go on," she whispered. "Go show them how it's done." USA walked down the steps, leaving the shadows of the porch behind. As he reached the driveway, Imani handed him the bow. It felt lighter than a sword, more delicate than a pen, and infinitely more powerful than any signet ring he had ever worn. He tucked the violin under his chin, his large frame looking slightly absurd in the domestic setting, and played a single perfect note. It was a clear, resonant sound that signaled the end of the 13-year debt. Later that evening, as the stars began to peek through the suburban sky, the three of them sat around the dinner table. There were no bodyguards at the door, no burner phones vibrating on the mahogany, and no secrets hidden in the ink on Guesse's skin. There was only the sound of clinking silverware, the smell of peanut stew, and the low hum of a family discovering itself for the first time. Na Gyu-sa, the man who had once destroyed his own composure with 7 words, had finally found his voice again. And as he looked at Amy and Imani, he realized that the greatest empire he would ever build wasn't made of steel and stone. It was made of the quiet, everyday moments he had finally learned how to keep. The story of the Mafia boss was over. The story of Gyu-sa had finally begun. The transformation of Na Gyu-sa from a shadow-dwelling king to a man standing in the sunlight serves as a profound meditation on the true nature of power. For 13 years, Gyu-sa operated under the delusion that authority was built through fortresses, silences, and the ability to inspire fear. He believed that by holding the world at arm's length, he was protecting what was ours, unaware that he was actually starving the very soul of his family. The educational arc of this narrative reveals that the armor we build to survive our past often becomes the cage that prevents our future. The moral of Gyu-sa and Amy's story is that redemption is not a single act of valor, but a persistent series of humble choices. It teaches us that being present is a greater form of protection than being powerful. When Gyu-sa finally laid down his signet rings, he didn't lose his strength. He simply redirected it. He proved that a man's legacy is not written in the skyline of a city or the ledgers of an empire, but in the trust of a child and the mended heart of a partner. Ultimately, this story reminds us that it is never too late to do the math of our own lives. We can choose to remain ghosts of our own making, or we can choose to be the person who finally answers the call, admits their cowardice, and walks through the yellow door. True composure isn't the absence of emotion. It is the courage to be vulnerable in the face of the people who matter most. As the music of Imani's violin fades into the suburban night, the lesson remains. Power is found in the surrender, and home is wherever you finally decide to stop running.